Hi guys, it's Mr. Mans, and I'm going to continue the story of Orphans of the Tide. So far it seems like Seth has managed to get away. Seth, who they thought was the vessel, but it doesn't look like he is the vessel. And I think that we've uncovered that Claude Hestermeyer, who writes the diary entries, it appears that he actually is the vessel. Whoever the vessel might be and what he does, we don't know yet. But it looks like Seth's got away. So we'll carry on from there. Chapter 7. It walks among us. The bell of the Inquisition tolled above, a cold, heavy sound that startled roosting seagulls into flight. Doors banged, keys rattled, heavy bolts thudded into place. Children were hushed, shutters were closed, prayers were muttered to the saints. High overhead, a cloud of fireworks smoke drifted across the rooftops, hiding the moon from view. Ellie and Anna scurried across the cobblestones, splashing through puddles. The streets were a blue-grey haze of mist and rain. He just vanished, said Anna. He must be the vessel. How else could he have got off that bonfire? Unless... She looked at Ellie in horror. Oh no, you didn't! Ellie's throat tightened. Of course not, she said weakly. Anna couldn't know. She just couldn't. You did, didn't you? Said Anna. The fireworks that were exactly your style. You found some secret passage beneath the square and used fireworks as a distraction and broke him out the cage and... Shh! Ellie hissed, glancing at the tenement flats around them. She knew who might be listening from behind locked doors. I was with you the whole time, remember? She whispered. And I was in the workshop all afternoon. But Anna didn't look convinced. She stared across the street at the cramped, dismal-looking coal cellar next to the orphanage, its door hanging from its hinges. She sighed. Her eyes were big and glossy in the mid-moonlight. You would tell me if you were up to something, right? I don't want anything bad to happen to you. Ellie nodded and felt a painful stab of guilt. Anna was her best friend, but there were some things she could never know about. Finn was one of them. I'm tired. I need to go to bed, Ellie said. It was true. She felt like she would collapse at any moment. Anna looked her up and down. Yeah, you look terrible. I think you've caught a cold. I told you to dry off after Hargrave dropped you in the sea. Why don't you just sleep in the orphanage? It's much warmer than your freezing workshop. Ellie hesitated. You wouldn't have to use your old room, Anna continued, seemingly encouraged. Emma's got lice and they've quarantined her in a room by herself, so there's a free bed next to mine. But there's no lice in it now, she added hastily. Ellie shook her head. Thanks, but I'll be better in the workshop. Anna glumly dragged her toe through a puddle. Knew I shouldn't have mentioned the lice, she muttered. They hugged goodnight and Ellie squeezed Anna more tightly than she normally would have done. Ellie was still unlocking the workshop when she noticed two guardsmen walking up the street towards her. Hello? She said nervously. Eleanor Lancaster? Yeah, that's me. Lord Castian's asked us to stand watch outside your workshop tonight. Oh, really? Why? He didn't say. Ellie scowled, wondering how much Castian had paid them. He was probably worried that Seth could come looking for her. She muttered a good night, then slunk inside, heaving the door closed and slamming the bolts into their latches. I have to find him, she whispered, fiddling the hole in her coat sleeve. She fished out a match from her pocket, lit the whale oil lamp hanging by the door, then darted across the workshop, weaving in between workbenches, towers of books and piles of scrap metal. She bounded towards the door of her bedroom, flinging her coat on the back of a chair and tying her hair back. Escaping her workshop without the guardsman noticing would be no problem. There was a door in the basement that led to the sewers. First, though, she needed some sort of disguise, so she could move through the city unrecognised. She lit another lamp by her bedroom door, then stepped inside. Seth was lying unconscious on the floor. Ellie scrabbled for the doorframe, a hand to her mouth. He was still dressed in ragged trousers, his black hair wild as ever. His feet were scratched and dirty, and the bruising on his chest and face looked terrible up close. Angry blotches of red and purple. Ellie looked over her shoulder, fully expecting to find Finn lurking somewhere in the workshop, waiting to surprise her. But she couldn't see him anywhere. She gazed back at Seth in amazement until a sharp instinct pressed in on her. He was in her bedroom. She had to get him out again. She bent and tried to lift him, but it was much too heavy. The moment she had him up, her whole body wrenched back down. Ellie eased him to the floor, none too gently, his head lolling towards her. His face was startling, his large, closed eyes and wide cheekbones giving him an appearance that was almost feline. She slid her arm under his trousers rustling as she strained and heaved and dragged him across the floor. She hauled him out to his room, sweating already, and his eyes opened. They caught each other's gaze, and it was like they'd both woken from a nightmare. Ellie fell backwards, smacking against a workbench. Seth leapt to his feet, breathing heavily. His eyes darted round the workshop, pausing on the skeleton of the giant turtle, on the mountain of books clustered at the centre of the room, on the harpoon gun, its sharp point glinting in the lamplight. "Where are my brothers and sisters?" he whispered. I don't know," Ellie said. She wondered if his memory was coming back. "Did you see them in the crowd? Do you know their names? What do they look like?" Seth stared at his feet, frowning. "I can't remember." He looked at her seriously. "But I think they need my help." All of a sudden he clenched a hand to his throat like he'd been slapped there. "Water!" he yelled hoarsely. "Water!" "Don't shout," Ellie hissed. "There are 2 guardsmen right outside." Seth shook his head. "So," he wheezed, "what can they do to me?" Ellie screwed up her face, confused by his confidence. "They'll kill you, that's what they'll do." "I'll tear their heads off with my bare hands," said Seth. "Oh yeah, I bet you would," she said scornfully. "Don't be stupid, they'll arrest you and march you right back to the bonfire." "I'd like to see them try," said Seth. Ellie frowned. "They did try, and they would have succeeded if I hadn't rescued you." But Seth had doubled over, wheezing and pouring at his throat. Ellie supposed he hadn't had anything to drink all day. "All right, wait," she said, and hurried towards a sink in the corner. There was a shine of glass against glass, and she turned to see that Seth had removed a jar of yellow liquid from one of the shelves. It had a dead rat in it. "What are you doing?" she said. He had taken the lid off, pressing the edge of the jar to his lips. He coughed and held out the jar at arm's length, causing the rat to swish to one side. Liquid spilled over the edge. "What is that?" he spat. "It's preserving fluid, you idiot. I'm getting you some water." "Why do you have all these dead animals everywhere?" "I'm studying them, obviously," Ellie said. She filled a mug with water and rushed back to Seth, shoving it in his hands and carefully returning the dead rat to its shelf. "The experiments are really interesting, actually." "More," said Seth. Ellie stared in disbelief at the empty mug. "How did you drink that so fast?" Seth just stared back at her. "It's you," he said. "You were there this morning on the roof." "Of course I was," Ellie said resentfully. How could he have forgotten that she'd saved him from suffocating to death inside a whale? "You saved my life," he said, and shook Ellie's hand in both of his. "Thank you." "Ellie?" Ellie nodded, then her stomach turned as Seth pulled her sharply forward, so his mouth was right next to her ear. "Ellie, I need to get off this island," he whispered. "Everyone seems to want to kill me, and I don't think I can stop them all, if I'm honest." You can't stop any of them," she said, shoving him roughly away. She was starting to regret risking so much to rescue this boy. He seemed half wild and completely unpredictable. "And you can't get out of the city either." "Why not?" "Because there's nobody else to go." "Yeah, there must be other cities, though." "Other cities?" Ellie said in astonishment, taking a step away from him. "Of course there aren't any other cities. There's just this, the city." For emphasis, she pointed at a faded yellow map pinned to the wall. A single large jagged shape took up a third of the paper. It was simply labelled, capital letters, "The City." "Doesn't it have a name?" Seth asked. "Yeah, it might have done thousands of years ago. It used to be much, much bigger, but most of it's underwater now." "Well, what about these?" said Seth, pointing to a scattering of other, much smaller shapes around it. "Those are just farming and hunting islands," said Ellie. "I can live on one of them then. I bet I'm good at hunting." "You wouldn't last a day. Also, farmers live on the farming islands, and they'd be just as afraid of you as people are here." Seth squinted at the map. You get all your food from these tiny islands, but there were thousands of people in that square. The whale lords get most of the food for the city. They'd have these huge ships that they use to fish and hunt whales. It means that they're very powerful. They practically rule the city. Those men, the ones who put me in the cage, were they whale lords? Asked Seth. Ellie shook her head. No, they were inquisitors. They protect the city from the enemy. They really do rule the city, although you don't see them very often. Well, until now, that is. What's wrong? Seth was clutching his head and gritting his teeth. That noise, he looked round. Where's it coming from? Ellie frowned. What noise? That noise, he said, looking at her with wide eyes. He pointed to the ceiling. Listen, it keeps rising and falling. What is that noise? What does it sound like? Said Ellie uncertainly. Like a voice shouting, only I can't figure out the words. You can hear it, can't you? Asked Seth. Ellie listened but heard only silence. She grimaced in apology. No, Seth, did you tell the Inquisition you could hear this voice? What? No, I don't think so. Maybe. I can't remember a lot of it. They spent most of the time, he looked briefly ashamed, hitting me. The memory of this seemed to come flooding back to him. That man with one arm. He beat me, he roared, his whole body trembling with rage. Ellie pulled him by the elbow. Shut up, she hissed, looking at the door. You'll get us both caught. I have to get out of here, said Seth, right now. He rushed towards the door, but only managed 3 long paces before tripping. Ow! Be quiet! Seth grabbed his foot and held it up, revealing a bloody gash across the sole. He picked up a jagged curl of metal, one edge now glistening with blood, then glared resentfully around the workshop. Don't you ever clean up, he said, pointing to a crumpled dress smeared with paint. Ellie's clothes were strewn everywhere, together with half-empty glasses of water, cups of tea, scraps of orange peel and slithers of apple core. He stared at a sheet of paper nearby. A stick of charcoal lay on it that had since been stepped on, a fine black powder sprayed across the floorboards. How can you stand to live in this mess? Will you listen? They will kill you if you go out there, said Ellie. Seth paused. Because I'm the vessel, he said, remembering. He sat down on the edge of the workbench, inspecting the cut on his foot. They said I had the enemy inside me. But who's the enemy? Ellie sighed, getting fed up of him. That's the last god. Well, what happened to all the others then? They drowned the world, said Ellie. Only the enemy tricked them, and they ended up drowning too. The city is all that's left. It was built on one of the highest mountains, the only part that sticks above the sea. So where is the enemy? Said Seth. Well, it depends. Ellie leaned against a bookcase. Sometimes it's floating around in the air as just a harmless spirit. But eventually it chooses a vessel. Then it lives inside the vessel's mind, growing stronger and stronger, until it gets so strong that it can burst out of the vessel in its true physical form. It's called manifesting. What's that like? Asked Seth. Ellie shrugged. I've never seen it. The last time it happened was 23 years ago. But apparently the enemy's true form is truly terrifying. Stronger than 10 men and much, much, much faster. That's why the Inquisitors try to find and kill the vessel before the enemy can manifest. But if it does, the Inquisitors have to destroy it. Usually it kills a lot of people first. The person who defeats it gets to become a saint when they die. And then what happens to the enemy? Ellie shrugged again. No one really knows. It goes away for a while, sometimes many years, but it always comes back eventually. So they think I have this enemy inside me, Seth said, putting a hand to his heart. For the first time, he didn't seem so sure of himself. That's why all those people were so happy to watch me die. Unfortunately, yeah. But how do I know I'm not the vessel? You'd know if you were. You'll be able to see the enemy. That's the vessel's gift. Seth thought about this for a moment. Well then, I know what I have to do, he said. What? I need to find the real vessel and kill him. Ellie's breath caught. What? No, that's stupid. Seth rolled his eyes. Well, of course it wouldn't make sense to you. You don't have an entire city trying to kill you. I'm leaving and you can't stop me. He headed for the door. Wait! Ellie raced to cut him off. If those guards outside see you, the Inquisitors will know I'm helping you, and I'll probably get burned alive too. That's not the kindest way to repay me for saving your life twice in one day. Twice, said Seth, frowning. Ellie folded her arms. Who else do you think rescued you from that bonfire? She said, feeling another twinge of guilt at this sort of lie. You rescued me? Well, I had a friend, Ellie said. He was able to get you out. How? In front of all those people? Ellie scrunched up her face. She didn't like talking about Finn. He's just good at that sort of thing, she said. He must be a wise man, said Seth. Ellie shifted uncomfortably. He's a boy. A very clever boy, but not always a nice boy. Then why did he save my life? Because I asked him to. We've known each other a long time, and he's always proving he's cleverer than me. What's his name, then? Finn, Ellie said, swallowing. He must have risked his life just to save me. Can I meet him? No, Ellie said flatly. He's got a terrible temper. Better not to be around him. She was worried that Seth would keep asking questions, but he seemed to have lost interest. His eyes drifted around the workshop, then rested on the window above. It was set into the sloping roof and had a ladder leading up to it. I bet there's no guards out there, he said with a wicked smile. Don't you dare, said Ellie. But he was already racing towards it, nimbly bounding over workbenches and leaping between Ellie's chemistry set and the shelves of bottled powders. He reached the ladder. Stop! Ellie yelled. Seth turned. What are you doing? He sighed. Ellie had grabbed a harpoon gun and was aiming it straight at him. Miss Lancaster, came a muffled voice from the street. Are you okay in there? I'm fine, thank you, Ellie called. Just dealing with some rats. She looked pointedly at Seth. Ungrateful rats. What's that? Said Seth. A harpoon gun, obviously. Mum built it. The whale lords used to use these to kill things much bigger and less annoying than you. You won't shoot me, he said. I will, says Ellie. Seth peered curiously into her eyes, then laughed. No, you won't. I can tell. He started to climb. Ellie's hands trembled on the harpoon gun. Then she groaned and let it go. Looking around, she spotted a brass contraption by her foot. It resembled a small portable cannon with a clockwork winding mechanism on the side. I'll use this instead, she announced, pointing at him, finger on the trigger. Seth sneered. Did your mum make that too? No, I did. It's ingenious. It fires a big net. It's meant for catching bears and wolves, but you'll do for now. Seth snorted. I don't believe you. You don't seem very smart. I am smart, Ellie bristled furiously. I spent months on this, and I didn't get any help. I didn't even use my mum's books. Seth kept climbing, and Ellie muttered a curse, then pulled the trigger. There was a loud thunk and a screech of metal, and something smacked Ellie hard in the nose. Pain exploded across her face. Ow! She cried, dropping the net cannon and clasping her hands to her nose. No, 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 she muttered. She heard the rungs of the ladder juddering. Seth must have got away. Her stupid, worthless invention. A hand touched her shoulder, making Ellie yelp in surprise. She looked up into Seth's dark eyes. Oh, she said. Are you all right? Ellie stared at him, astonished. Seth leaned in close, touching his hand gently to her face. Does it hurt? She nodded, noticing blood on Seth's fingers. I think you've broken your nose, he said. What? Ellie moaned, touching it lightly with her fingers. Are you sure? Seth nodded. Well, it's sort of kind of turned to one side. It already did that, said Ellie. Oh, said Seth. Well, then it's not broken then. Here. He picked up a brass cylinder from the ground. This is what burst out that net thing. Ellie grabbed it from his hand. Why are you still here? She said sourly, picking up a cloth and pressing it to her nose to stem the bleeding. Seth looked up at the window. I don't know. Maybe you're right. You seem very, I don't know, persistent? He winced and put his hands to his temples. The voice again, Ellie asked. He nodded. It won't go away. He squeezed his eyes shut. It keeps crashing and crashing. How can you not hear it? Look, you can't go out there, said Ellie. There's too much you don't understand. Seth nodded distractedly. Pinch your nose, it will help stop the bleeding. How do you know that? Seth thought about this. I'm not sure, he said. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes puffy, his forehead clammy. He slumped down on the floor, leaning against a workbench. What sort of city tries to burn a boy alive, Ellie? They were shouting in the street as a crowd clamoured by. They sounded afraid. Ellie looked down at Seth and shrugged an apology. This one. This city. Okay, that's the end of chapter 6. But actually, we now go into, there's a little bit more. There's the diary of Claude Hestermeyer as well. It sounds like the enemy manifests itself in the vessel. There's some mysterious spirit, and then that comes out of the vessel eventually. So the enemy is obviously very dangerous. Right, the Claude Hestermeyer, remember, this is the person that we think is the vessel, and this is his diary entry. A couple of pages, and then that's the end of this chapter. From the diary of Claude Hestermeyer. I have learned some upsetting news. Peter, the real Peter, was fond of gambling. Much too fond. I had thought he'd learned to control his habits. We had worked hard at it together. But it seemed he'd carried on in secret and incurred a large debt. Now the moneylenders have come to collect. From Peter's father. I went to visit him today to see how he'd been coping since the funeral. He had not been coping. His face was badly bruised and he needed my help to walk from the front step door to his chair. He winced with every step, clenching his sides. Who did this to you? I asked. I could not bear to see him this way. First for him to lose his son and now this. I felt somehow that it was my fault for failing to help Peter deal with his problem. I returned glumly to my office that night, trying to figure out how I could raise the money to clear the debt. I could help, said the enemy, as we walked up the street towards the university. I said distractedly. The enemy smiled. You do remember who I am, don't you? But you can't do things, I said. You can't even hold a glass of whiskey. I thought you studied the enemy for a living. I can do things if you ask me to. Try it, he said. Ask me to pick up that starfish. I stared down. Sure enough, there was a starfish lying on the cobblestones, grey and long since dried up. All right, I said. Pick up that starfish. To my amazement, he bent over, picked up the dead starfish, and put it right in my hand. It wasn't an illusion. I could feel the weight of it. I found myself suddenly lightheaded. Now, try to think bigger, the enemy said. Much bigger. I considered this for a moment, and though a part of me screamed not to, I kept picturing Peter's father's bruised face. I'd failed to help Peter, but perhaps I could help him. Get the money he needs, I said. However you can. Sounds like the enemy is getting stronger. All right. Right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Certainly the plot continues to get deeper and deeper and thicker. Be interested to see how Ellie and Seth, what they do next in this one. All right, guys, see you later. Bye-bye.